What kind of learning uses rote memory? How can a person learn to make new connections between old and new information? And finally, how can teachers promote longer retention of learning? Okay, so let's first go through what rote memory is. And that's a learning technique where it's done strictly through memorization. You don't necessarily have to understand what you're memorizing. You just are processing the information and retaining the information without necessarily broader context for deeper learning. So that type of learning is usually learned in grammar and language, with math, history, especially with history, just memorizing dates and times and people, not necessarily the broader context of what's happening around these historical events. With music. So when you're learning music, you're just memorizing the notes one after another and putting them together instead of thinking about the composition as a whole. A lot of times what I've seen in students, they're memorizing their timetables and not necessarily learning the math behind it, the repetition of the numbers and the repetitive adding of the numbers. They're just learning times tables for the sake of learning times tables. So we want to know how we can make these connections from information that is new to information that we already know. So we want to use tools like analogies. So if you use like analogies or metaphors, it tells a story. So we want to tell a story to retain the information. Again, it gives us a broader context. Another way to retain information and link the information from things that you have newly learned to things that you already know. It's to teach somebody else what you've learned. Visual aids always help. And then you practice memorizing in the context of a story or broader information that will inform you and help you memorize what you have learned. Also, you always want to reflect and summarize, go over the information, recall it, think about it, put it in your own words, and that will help you or help a student retain information. Also, discussing it, critical thinking in discussions, having different points of view, engaging in a dialogue will also help you connect new information and things that you already know. So things that teachers could do to promote longer retention of learning is spaced repetition. And so if you introduce the material or introduce the math or introduce the history several times over a elongated period of time, then the student is more likely to retain that information instead of just cramming it all in. Also, real world applications. So when we talk about critical thinking, things that we learn in history, we can apply it to the real world or see how events in the present time are happening similarly. One technique that my parents used in math, for example, was to use objects that I liked or use things that, I was fond of and put those into math problems so that I would be able to digest and think critically about the problem instead of just memorizing the formula to the problem. So we also want to talk about multisensory approaches, not just like complete rote memorization, but engaging other senses to introduce classical conditioning so that you would have a response, a stimulus, or a memory associated with that stimuli in relation to learning.